That's what Lydia thought as she pushed herself up from the ground, dust coating her palms, the afternoon sun pressing down like a blacksmith's anvil. Her left hand, the one with scars that ran from knuckle to wrist in rivulets of puckered skin, trembled as she braced against the earth. No one in Miller's doorway moved. No one called out. She'd expected nothing different. She'd been expecting nothing for 3 months now, ever since the fire took everything. The blaze had started in the kitchen of the boarding house where she'd worked, a grease fire that spread faster than screaming. She'd gotten out. Her employer hadn't. Neither had the roof, the walls, or Lydia's small room with its single trunk of belongings. The town council had called it an accident. The landlord had called it negligence. Either way, Lydia had walked away with burns on her hands, soot in her lungs, and a reputation that followed her like smoke. No one hired a woman who brought fire. She'd tried. Knocked on every door in Salton, then the next town, then the one after that. Took what work she could, laundry by the river, mending in back rooms, once 3 days mucking stables for a man who'd paid her in bread and told her not to come back. The coins ran out. The bread ran out. And when the last boarding house turned her away because of the whispers that preceded her, Lydia had started walking. She didn't know the name of this town. Didn't matter. They were all the same, wood and dust and people who'd already decided what she was worth. Nothing. The sun hammered down as she stood, swaying. Her dress, once gray, now the color of old ash, hung loose on a frame that had lost weight it couldn't afford to lose. Her boots, held together with twine and stubbornness, left prints in the dust that the wind erased before she'd taken 3 steps. Ahead, the town stretched in a single main street. A general store, a stable, a church with a crooked steeple, and a collection of buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and forgotten just as fast. Beyond that, fields of yellow grass shimmered in the heat, and beyond that, mountains rose purple and distant. Lydia walked. Not toward anything, just away from the stairs. She passed the stable. A boy mucking stalls looked up, then quickly away. Past a house with laundry snapping on a line. A woman's hand stilled on a clothespin, watching. Past the church. Its door was open, but Lydia didn't slow. She'd learned that mercy had conditions, and she no longer met them. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub grass and the road became 2 wagon ruts heading nowhere, Lydia stopped. Nowhere left to go. The thought settled over her with the same weight as the heat. She looked back at the town, small, unwelcoming, already forgetting her, looked forward at the empty road, looked up at the sky, bleached white and merciless. Then she looked down at the shade beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves dusty but still green, and made a decision that wasn't really a decision at all. She'd sleep there tonight. Maybe tomorrow she'd have the strength to keep walking. Maybe not. Lydia sank down against the trunk, the bark rough through the thin fabric of her dress. She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, and let her head fall back. The cicadas were screaming, the heat pressed close, and for the first time in 3 months, Lydia stopped moving. She closed her eyes. "But, you gonna die there?" The voice was small, curious, completely unafraid. Lydia's eyes opened to find 2 identical faces staring down at her. Girls, maybe 7 years old, barefoot and sunbrowned, wearing faded calico dresses that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches. They had wheat-colored braids and eyes the color of creek water in summer. "No," Lydia said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Not planning on it." "You look like you might," the girl on the left said matter-of-factly. "You're real skinny, and your face is red." "Clara," the other girl hissed. "That's rude." "It's true, Sadie." They were twins. Lydia could see it now in the way they stood, mirrored and matched, right down to the skeptical tilt of their heads. "I'm just resting," Lydia said, though even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "In the heat?" Claire asked. "Seems like poor planning," Sadie added. Despite everything, the hunger, the exhaustion, the bone-deep certainty that she'd run out of road, Lydia almost smiled. "It does, doesn't it?" The girls exchanged a look, some twin communication passing between them that needed no words. Then Sadie crouched down, bringing herself eye level with Lydia. You got a husband? She asked. No. You got a house? No. You got any people? Lydia's throat tightened. No. Another look passed between the girls. Then Clara crouched too, and together they studied Lydia with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. Our pa needs a wife, Clara said. And we need someone who'll stay, Sadie added. Lydia blinked. What? It's real simple, Claire explained, as if offering marriage to a stranger under a tree was the most natural thing in the world. Our ma died 2 years back. Pa does his best, but he can't braid hair right and he burns everything he cooks. And sometimes, she glanced at her sister, sometimes we get scared at night and there's nobody to talk to except each other. The last woman who came stayed 3 days, Sadie said. Said our house was too far from town and Pa was too quiet. The one before that stayed a week, then married the banker instead. But you look like you might stay, Clara said, tilting her head, 'cause you got nowhere else to go. It should have stung. Instead, Lydia found it oddly refreshing, this blunt, unflinching assessment from 2 children who'd clearly learned that honesty was more useful than kindness. Your father sent you to find him a wife? Lydia asked. No, Sadie admitted. He doesn't know we're here, but he won't say no if we bring you home. He never says no to us. And if he did, we'd just keep asking, Clara added cheerfully. Lydia should have said no. Should have explained that she wasn't suitable, wasn't safe, wasn't the kind of woman any man would want in his house or any children should want in their lives. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by the weight of 3 months walking and the memory of every door that had closed. I'm not, she started, then stopped. Not what? Not worthy? Not whole? Not the woman she used to be? All true. None of it seemed to matter to the 2 girls watching her with something that looked dangerously close to hope. Just come for supper, Sadie said. That's all. Just come and see. Pa always makes too much anyway, Clara added, on account of he can't measure right. The sun was starting to sink, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Lydia's stomach, which had stopped complaining days ago, gave a hollow twist at the mention of food. She looked at the girls, these strange, earnest, barefoot children who'd appeared like something out of a fever dream, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope. She was too tired for hope, but maybe curiosity. Maybe that was enough. Just for supper, Lydia said. The girls' faces split into identical grins. The farmhouse sat a mile outside town, down a wagon road that cut through fields of tall grass gone gold in the heat. It was small. Weathered gray wood, a porch that sagged on one side, a chimney listing slightly to the left. But the windows were clean, and there was a vegetable garden beside the house where tomato plants drooped in the evening heat, and a well with a bucket that looked freshly painted. The girls led Lydia around back, where a man was splitting wood despite the temperature, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his movements economical and steady. He didn't hear them approach over the sound of the axe, and for a moment Lydia just watched him work, tall and lean, dark hair curling at his collar, forearms corded with muscle that came from labor, not leisure. Pa! Clara called. The axe paused mid-swing. The man turned, and Lydia got her first clear look at Thomas Reed. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too weathered, too lined for a man who couldn't be much past 35. His jaw was dark with stubble, his eyes, gray as winter sky, were cautious in a way that spoke of disappointment worn smooth by time. But there was something solid about him, something steady, like a fence post that had weathered every storm and remained standing. Those gray eyes moved from his daughters to Lydia, and she saw the exact moment he registered what they'd done. A flash of resignation followed by something that might have been embarrassment. Girls, he said, his voice low and rough as creek gravel. What did you do? We brought you a wife, Claire announced proudly. Her name's... Sadie paused, looking stricken. We didn't ask your name. Lydia, she supplied quietly. Lydia Moore. Thomas set the axe down carefully, wiped his hands on his trousers, and removed his hat in a gesture that was purely automatic. Thomas Reed. I apologize for my daughters. They mean well, but they don't always think things through. We thought it through plenty, Clara protested. She was dying under a tree. I wasn't dying, Lydia said. You looked like you were, Sadie countered. Thomas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. He studied Lydia with the same quiet intensity his daughters had shown, though his assessment was different. Not cataloging her usefulness, but her fragility. She saw his gaze catch on her scarred hands, her too thin frame, the burns on her wrist visible where her sleeve had pulled back. She waited for the questions. They didn't come. Instead, he said, You hungry, Miss Moore? The unexpected kindness of it, the lack of judgment, the simple offer, hit Lydia harder than any rejection. Her eyes burned and she blinked hard against the sudden pressure. Yes, she whispered. He nodded once. Then you'll stay for supper. After that, he glanced at his daughters, then back to Lydia. After that, you're welcome to the spare room for the night. It's too hot to be walking, and too late besides. Morning's soon enough to figure out what comes next. It was a kindness she didn't deserve and couldn't repay. Lydia knew she should refuse it, should explain about the fire and the whispers and all the reasons why staying, even for a night, was a mistake. But she was so tired of walking. Just until morning, she said. Just until morning, Thomas agreed. The inside of the house was cleaner than Lydia expected, and more chaotic than she'd hoped. There were books stacked on every available surface, children's drawings pinned to the walls, a basket of mending that had clearly been abandoned mid-stitch, and a pervasive smell of burned something that suggested Thomas's cooking was exactly as poor as his daughters had advertised. The girls disappeared to wash up, leaving Lydia standing awkwardly in the main room while Thomas moved to the kitchen, a lean-to addition that had a stove, a work table, and shelves lined with mismatched dishes. I was planning on beans and cornbread, he said, not looking at her. But I burned the cornbread this morning, so it's just beans. I could make the cornbread, Lydia offered, the words out before she could stop them. If you have the fixings. Thomas paused, his back still to her. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, pride or suspicion or simple male stubbornness. Then he stepped aside. Fixings are in the pantry. I'd be grateful. It had been months since Lydia had cooked in a real kitchen, longer since anyone had trusted her near a stove. Her hands shook as she measured cornmeal, as she cracked eggs, as she stirred the batter smooth. But the motions were familiar, muscle memory from a life before fire and ash, and slowly the shaking eased. Thomas worked beside her in silence, stirring beans, slicing salt pork, setting the table with movements that were careful and deliberate. He didn't ask questions, didn't make conversation, just shared the space like it was the most natural thing in the world to have a strange woman in his kitchen making cornbread while the sun went down. The girls returned scrubbed pink, their hair still wet, chattering about a nest of rabbits they'd found near the creek and whether they should try to catch one for a pet. Thomas listened with half his attention, the other half on the stove where Lydia was pulling out cornbread that was golden and perfect and smelled like every home she'd ever lost. That looks right, he said quietly. Lydia set the pan down, her scarred hands wrapped in a towel. It's been a while. Couldn't tell. They ate at a table by the window, the four of them crowded onto benches that didn't quite match. The girls talked enough for all of them, about the rabbits, about a horse in town they wanted to ride, about how the preacher's wife had the meanest cat in the territory. Thomas ate slowly, watching his daughters with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and devotion. And Lydia. Lydia ate cornbread and beans that tasted better than anything she'd had in months, and tried not to think about how temporary this was, how morning would come and she'd have to leave this warm kitchen and these strange, kind people behind. You make good cornbread, Clara said through a mouthful. Clara, manners, Thomas said mildly. But she does. She does, he agreed. But we still chew with our mouths closed. After supper, the girls insisted on showing Lydia their room, a small space under the eaves with two narrow beds, a shared trunk, and a window that looked out over the fields. They showed her their treasures. A bird's nest, a collection of pretty rocks, a doll made from corn husks that had seen better days. Ma made that, Sadie said, touching the doll's yarn hair, before she got sick. She was real good at making things, Clara added. Pa says we got her hands. Lydia looked at their small, capable hands and thought of the woman who'd shaped them, who'd lived in this house and loved these children and left a hole that two little girls were trying to fill with rabbits and rocks and strange women found under trees. I'm sure you did, she said softly. When the girls were finally settled, after 3 glasses of water, 2 more stories, and 1 lengthy negotiation about whether the window should be open or closed, Lydia retreated downstairs to find Thomas on the porch, sitting on the steps with a cup of coffee and the kind of stillness that came from bone-deep fatigue. He looked up when she appeared but didn't speak. Lydia sat down on the opposite end of the step, leaving space between them. The night had brought some relief from the heat, though the air was still thick and close. Crickets sang in the grass. Somewhere distant, a coyote called. They're good girls, Lydia said. They are. Thomas took a sip of coffee. Too smart for their own good sometimes, but good. They miss their mother. Every day. He stared out at the dark fields. She died in winter. Pneumonia. Lasted 3 weeks, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do but watch. The rawness in his voice was unexpected, unguarded. Lydia recognized it. That particular helplessness that came from loving someone and losing them anyway. I'm sorry, she said. Me too. He was quiet for a moment, then, the girls, they've been trying to find me a wife for 6 months now. Brought home the school teacher, the minister's daughter, a woman passing through on the stage. None of them stayed. Because of the house? Because of me? He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. I'm not much for talking, and I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. The girls think that's fine, but most women want more. What do you want? Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and Lydia felt exposed under that steady gray gaze. Someone who won't leave, he said finally. Someone who'll stay when things get hard. When the crops fail, or the girls get sick, or the loneliness gets so big it's hard to breathe. Someone real. The honesty of it was staggering. Lydia's chest tightened. I can't be that, she said. I can't be anyone's answer. She held up her scarred hands. I'm broken. I bring bad luck. There was a fire and people died, and everywhere I go, people know. They look at me and see ash. I see someone who makes good cornbread, Thomas said. And someone my girls trust, which doesn't come easy, and someone who's tired of walking. That's not enough to build a life on. Maybe not. He turned back to the fields. But it's enough for 1 more day. Stay through tomorrow. Help with the girls, have some real meals, sleep in a real bed. Day after that, we'll see. It was the same offer as before, just until morning, just 1 more day, and Lydia knew it was a trap, the kind built from kindness instead of malice. Every day would lead to another until she forgot how to leave. But she was so tired of walking. 1 more day, she whispered. Thomas nodded and said nothing more. The spare room was small but clean, with a bed that had a real mattress and sheets that smelled like sun and soap. Lydia lay awake for a long time, listening to the house settle, to Thomas's footsteps as he checked the girls one last time, to the silence that followed when he finally went to his own room. She thought about leaving, thought about slipping out before dawn, before the girls woke up, before she could do any more damage to people who'd shown her nothing but unearned kindness. But when morning came, hot and bright and merciless, Lydia found herself in the kitchen instead, making coffee the way Thomas liked it, strong and black, and frying eggs that the girls ate with enthusiasm while their father watched with something that might have been relief or might have been hope. And when he asked, casual as anything, if she might stay another day, Lydia said yes, just 1 more day. That's what she told herself as she mended the girls' dresses, as she weeded the vegetable garden, as she learned that Thomas took his coffee with 2 spoons of sugar, even though he claimed to like it black, that Clara was left-handed, and Sadie had nightmares about storms, that the chickens had names and distinct personalities according to the twins. 1 more day turned into 3, then 5, then a week, and Lydia stopped counting. The town noticed, of course. Small towns always noticed when something changed, when the pattern broke, when a woman who'd arrived with nothing started being seen at the general store with Thomas Reed's daughters, buying flour and sugar and fabric for new dresses. The whispers started quietly. Speculation about what exactly Lydia Moore was doing out at the Reed place, whether Thomas had finally found himself a wife or just hired help, whether it was proper for an unmarried woman to be living under a widower, even if there were children present. Lydia heard the whispers, ignored them. She'd heard worse, but the girls heard them too, and they didn't have Lydia's practice at pretending not to care. It was Sadie who came home crying first, a week and a half after Lydia had arrived. She wouldn't say what happened, just pressed her face into Lydia's apron and shook with silent sobs until Clara, always the braver one, explained that some boys in town had said their pa was living in sin and Lydia was a— "Don't repeat it," Lydia said sharply. Clara's jaw set. "But they said—" "It doesn't matter what they said." "It matters to us," Sadie whispered against Lydia's stomach. Lydia's hands, scarred and steady, stroked Sadie's hair, and she felt something shift inside her chest, some wall she'd built cracking under the pressure of two small girls who'd claimed her without permission and refused to let go. "Come here," she said, sitting down and pulling both girls close. "Listen to me. People are going to talk. That's what people do. They're going to say things about me, about your father, about all of us. And some of those things will be cruel, and some will be true, and most will be both." "That's not fair," Clara said fiercely. "No, it's not. But you can't stop people from talking. You can only decide whether you're going to let their words make you small." Lydia tilted Sadie's chin up, then Clara's, meeting their eyes. "You are not small. Your father is a good man doing his best, and her voice caught. "I am trying to be someone worth staying for. That's all that matters. Not what people say. What we know to be true." "Do you think we're worth staying for?" Sadie asked, her voice very small. Lydia's throat closed. She pulled them tighter, these two fierce, fragile girls who'd found her under a tree and decided she belonged to them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I do." That night, after the girls were asleep, Thomas found Lydia in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary. He didn't ask what was wrong. He'd learned by now that Lydia would talk when she was ready or not at all. Instead, he picked up a towel and started drying, working in the comfortable silence they'd developed over the past week and a half. "The girls told me what happened in town," he said finally. Lydia's hand stilled in the wash water. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For bringing this to your door, for making their lives harder." Thomas set down the plate he'd been drying and turned to face her. "Lydia, look at me." She did reluctantly. "My girls have never been happier," he said. "They sleep through the night now. They eat real food. They laugh more than they have since their mother died. If the price for that is some small-minded gossip from people who've got nothing better to do than judge, then I'll pay it gladly. But no." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You don't get to decide you're not worth the trouble. That's my choice, and theirs, and we've already made it." Lydia stared at him, this quiet man who spoke so rarely but somehow always knew exactly what to say. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you choose this?" "Choose me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes steady on hers. "Because you stayed," he said finally. "Not because you had nowhere else to go. You could have kept walking. But because you saw two girls who needed someone and you decided they mattered more than your fear. That's not nothing, Lydia. That's everything." The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and heavy and almost unbearable in their sincerity. Lydia turned back to the dishes, blinking hard against the pressure behind her eyes. "Just so you know," Thomas added, his voice lighter now, "the whole town's going to assume we're married within a month anyway. We could make it official if you wanted. Or not. Either way, you're staying." It wasn't a proposal. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty Thomas brought to everything. Chopping wood, mending fences, raising daughters. Lydia should have been offended by the presumption. Instead, she felt something dangerously close to relief. "We'll see," she said. Thomas smiled, a real smile, rare and genuine and gone too quick. "We'll see," he agreed. And for the first time in 3 months, Lydia let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where seeing was enough. The heat pressed down, relentless. The cicadas screamed their endless song. And in a small farmhouse, a mile outside a town that had decided what she was worth, Lydia Moore washed dishes beside a man who'd decided differently, and felt something she'd thought burned away in the fire. Possibility. The The storm came 3 weeks after Lydia arrived, rolling in from the mountains with the kind of darkness that turned afternoon into twilight. The air grew thick and electric, pressing against the skin like a living thing. Thomas was in the far field checking fence posts when the first drops fell, fat and heavy as coins. Lydia stood on the porch, watching the horizon swallow itself in gray-black clouds. Her hands gripped tight on the railing. She'd grown up in cities where storms meant finding shelter and waiting them out. Out here, storms meant animals to secure, windows to shutter, 100 small emergencies that couldn't wait. "Lydia!" Clara came running from the chicken coop, her apron full of eggs. "The hens are going crazy." "Get inside," Lydia said, already moving. "Put those eggs down careful and help your sister close the shutters." She'd learned the layout of the farm through those 3 weeks. Learned it the way you learn anything when survival depends on paying attention. The barn was 40 yards east, the well 30 yards north, the vegetable garden a minefield of tomato stakes and bean poles that could turn an ankle in the growing dark. The chickens scattered as she entered the coop, squawking their indignation. Lydia moved efficiently, checking nests, securing the door, her scarred hands sure despite the way the wind was starting to howl. The first real crack of thunder made her jump, made something old and afraid curl tight in her stomach. Fire started with lightning. Fire started when the sky opened up and struck without warning. She pushed the thought away and ran for the barn. Thomas's horse, a patient gray mare named Cassie, stamped nervously in her stall. The 2 cows were already huddled together in the corner, their eyes rolling white. Lydia checked water, scattered fresh hay, latched the barn door from the inside just as the sky opened and rain came down like a river falling. Through the gaps in the barn wood, she could see the house, lamplight glowing in the windows where the girls would be watching, waiting. She could make it if she ran. 30 yards of open ground, maybe less. Lightning split the sky, close enough that thunder followed instantly, a crack like the world breaking. Cassie screamed, an awful, primal sound, and reared in her stall. One hoof caught the latch, wood splintering. Before Lydia could react, the mare was out, wild-eyed and panicked, charging for the barn door. Lydia threw herself aside, hit the ground hard, tasted dirt and fear. By the time she scrambled up, Cassie was gone, disappeared into the storm. No, no, no. She was out the door before thinking, rain hitting her like fists, turning the world into water and wind, and the horrible certainty that the horse would break a leg in a gopher hole or run straight through a fence and Thomas would come home to find his children's mother's horse dead because Lydia hadn't been fast enough, smart enough, good enough. "Cassie!" She screamed the name into the storm, knowing it was useless, doing it anyway. "Cassie, come back!" The mare was a gray ghost in the rain, already 50 yards out, running blind. Lydia ran after her, boots sliding in mud, dress plastered to her legs. Lightning showed her the world in flashes, fence posts, the old oak tree, the creek beyond that would be rising fast in this rain. She saw the moment Cassie veered toward the creek, saw the bank, slick and crumbling, saw the horse lose footing, stumble, scream again. Then Thomas was there, appearing out of the rain like something conjured, his hands catching Cassie's halter just before she went over the edge. He held on, boots digging into mud, muscles straining against a terrified animal that outweighed him by 700 pounds. "The rope!" he shouted over the storm. "Barn, get rope!" Lydia ran. Her lungs burned. Her hands shook as she grabbed the coil of rope from its peg, as she ran back through rain that blinded and wind that shoved. Thomas still had the mare, barely, his face set in lines of pure determination. She threw him the rope. He caught it one-handed, looped it through the halter, secured it with knots that held even as Cassie pulled and fought. Together, Thomas hauling on the rope, Lydia at the mare's shoulder, pushing, encouraging, refusing to let go, they got the horse back from the edge, back to solid ground, back to something like safety. Thomas didn't let go until they had Cassie in the barn, the door secured behind them. Then he sagged against the wall, chest heaving, soaked through and shaking. "You shouldn't have run out," he said when he could speak. "Could have been killed." "So could you," Lydia shot back. "She's my horse. My responsibility." "She got out on my watch." Lydia's voice cracked. "If something had happened to her—" "But it didn't." Thomas pushed off the wall, closed the distance between them. Rain dripped from his hair, his jaw. His eyes were storm gray and fierce. Lydia, listen to me. Past me. You came after her. You helped me bring her back. That's what matters. His hands came up like he might touch her shoulders, then dropped. You're not responsible for every bad thing that might happen. You're allowed to just be here. To be human. The words hit something deep in Lydia's chest, some place that had been braced for blame for so long, it didn't know how to stand any other way. She looked at Thomas through the rain still dripping down her face and felt something break. I don't know how, she whispered. Thomas's expression softened. Then we'll figure it out. Both of us. Together. Thunder rolled overhead, closer now. The barn door rattled in the wind. And standing in the half-dark with rain drumming on the roof and a terrified horse settling behind them, Lydia felt the first real crack in the wall she'd built around herself. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They stood there until the worst of the storm passed, until the rain became steady instead of violent, until Cassie stopped trembling and started nosing at hay like nothing had happened. Then they ran for the house together, splashing through puddles, arriving breathless and soaked on the porch where two small worried faces pressed against the window. The girls threw the door open before Thomas could reach for the handle. We saw from upstairs, Clara said, her voice high with fear turned to relief. We saw Cassie run and Pa chase her and we thought you both might die, Sadie finished, tears streaming. Don't do that again. Don't ever do that again. Thomas knelt down, pulling both girls into a wet embrace that soaked their nightgowns. We're fine. Everyone's fine. The horse is safe, the barn is secure, and the only casualty is our dignity. And probably my boots, Lydia added, looking down at the mud-caked leather. I think they're done for. Clara hiccuped a laugh. Sadie scrubbed at her eyes. And just like that, the crisis shifted into something manageable, something that could be survived with dry clothes and hot coffee, and the simple fact of everyone being together under one roof while the storm raged outside. Lydia changed into a spare dress the girls had altered to fit her, their mother's dress, though no one said it out loud. It was blue calico, faded soft from washing, and it fit better than anything Lydia had worn in months. She braided her wet hair and came downstairs to find Thomas building up the fire, the girls wrapped in quilts on the floor nearby. Coffee's on, he said without looking up. Figured we could all use it. They sat together in the lamplight, listening to rain on the roof, watching shadows dance on the walls. The girls eventually dozed off, Sadie's head on Clara's shoulder, both of them breathing slow and easy. Thomas carried them up to bed one at a time, his footsteps quiet on the stairs. When he came back down, Lydia had poured 2 cups of coffee and was standing by the window watching the storm. Lightning still flickered on the horizon, but the worst had passed. Thank you, Thomas said, accepting the coffee. For going after her, for not giving up. I couldn't just let her go. Most people would have stayed in the barn, stayed safe. Lydia turned to face him. Is that what you think of me, that I'd choose safe? Thomas studied her over the rim of his cup. No, he said finally. I think you're the kind of person who runs toward trouble if someone needs help. I think that's what got you burned, and I think it's also what makes you unable to walk past 2 girls who need a mother. The words settled between them, honest and uncomfortable. Lydia looked down at her scarred hands wrapped around the warm cup. The fire, she said quietly. You never asked about it. Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. I was working in a boarding house kitchen. Grease fire started, spread faster than anyone expected. The owner, Mrs. Brennan, she was upstairs when it happened. Everyone was screaming, running, getting out. Lydia's voice went flat, distant. But I could hear her calling for help, and I went back in. Thomas didn't speak, just listened with that steady attention he gave everything. Found her in her bedroom, overcome by smoke. Got her to the stairs, but they were already burning. Had to go back through the kitchen, through the flames. Got her out. Got burns for my trouble. She touched her wrist where the scars were worst. She died anyway. 3 days later. Smoke in her lungs. You tried to save her. I failed to save her. And the town decided it was my fault. That I must have started it, must have been careless, must have been something other than what I was. A woman trying to help. Lydia's laugh was bitter. Insurance company refused to pay. Landlord blamed me. I lost my job, my room, my reputation, all because I ran toward the fire instead of away. You did what you thought was right, and people died anyway. That's what I bring, Thomas. Ash and failure and— Stop. His voice was firm. He set down his coffee and took hers from her hands, set it aside too. You listen to me. You are not responsible for what fire does. You are not responsible for who lives and who dies when the world is burning. You tried. You risked yourself. You have the scars to prove you didn't run, and anyone who judges you for that isn't worth the air they breathe. Lydia's eyes burned. The whole town judged me. Then the whole town was wrong. Thomas's hands closed over hers, warm and calloused and steady. You're not broken, Lydia. You're not cursed. You're just someone who's been hurt and blamed and told to believe it was deserved. But I've watched you these past 3 weeks. I've seen how you are with my daughters, how you handle scared chickens and runaway horses and all the small emergencies that come with living. And what I see is someone strong enough to stay when staying is hard. That's not broken. That's brave. The tears came then, hot and fast, the kind Lydia had been holding back for months. Thomas pulled her in, let her cry against his shoulder, his arms steady around her while the storm outside finally broke and rain became gentle instead of punishing. I'm scared, she whispered against his wet shirt. I'm scared I'll fail you. Fail them. We all fail sometimes, Thomas said into her hair. That's just being human. But you don't fail by trying. You only fail by walking away. And you haven't walked away yet. I want to stay, Lydia admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep. I want this to be real, but I don't know if I'm strong enough. Thomas pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, his hands framing her face with unexpected gentleness. You ran into a burning building to save someone. You walked 3 months with nothing but hope worn down to threads. You took on 2 grieving girls and a widower who burns cornbread, and you made this house feel like a home again. His thumb brushed away a tear. Lydia, you're the strongest person I know. You just don't see it yet. She wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly it hurt. What if the town doesn't accept it? She asked. What if they never let me forget? Then we'll deal with it, together. Thomas's voice was steady as stone. But I'm not letting you go because some people can't see past their own small-mindedness. Neither are my girls. You're ours now, if you want to be. The question is, do you want to be? It was the same question he'd asked that first night, dressed differently. Stay or go. Choose or walk away. Be brave enough to believe in possibility or keep running from ash. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Inside, the fire crackled warm. And Lydia, standing in a borrowed dress in a house that had somehow become home, held by a man who saw her scars and called her strong, made her choice. Yes, she said, I want to stay. Thomas's smile was slow and sure and warm as summer. Then stay. He kissed her forehead, simple and chaste, a promise instead of a demand. Then he stepped back, giving her space, giving her choice, giving her every reason to believe this might actually work. Get some sleep, he said. Storm's mostly past. Morning comes early. Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. She went upstairs to the small room that had become hers, changed into a nightgown the girls had helped her sew, and lay down in a bed that no longer felt temporary. Sleep came easier than it had in months. When morning arrived with weak sunshine and the smell of wet earth, Lydia came downstairs to find Thomas already making coffee, badly, and the girls setting the table with more enthusiasm than accuracy. She took over the coffee, started eggs and bacon, and listened to the girls chatter about the storm, about how brave Lydia and their pa had been, about how Cassie was probably embarrassed this morning. It felt normal, felt real, felt like family. The town, of course, heard about the storm, heard about Thomas Reed and the homeless woman running through lightning to save a horse, heard and judged and added it to the growing list of reasons why Lydia Moore shouldn't be living in that house. The whispers got louder. By the time Lydia went to town the following week, needing thread and flour and other small necessities, the stares had graduated from curious to openly hostile. Women pulled their children closer when she passed. Men exchanged knowing looks outside the saloon. And when she entered Miller's general store, the conversation stopped so completely she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Margaret Miller, the shopkeeper's wife, stood behind the counter with her mouth pressed thin. "Miss Moore." "Mrs. Miller." Lydia set her basket down, kept her voice steady. "I need thread. The heavy kind, if you have it, and 10 pounds of flour." "Thread's over there," Mrs. Miller gestured vaguely. "Flour's in back." No offer to help, no pleasant conversation. Just cold efficiency that made every second in the store feel like an examination Lydia was failing. She gathered her supplies, aware of every eye on her, every whisper that thought it was quiet enough. When she brought her goods to the counter, Mrs. Miller tallied them up in silence. "That'll be $2 even." Lydia counted out coins from the small pouch Thomas had given her. Household money, he'd called it, like she had every right to spend it. Like she belonged, Mrs. Miller took the money without comment, wrapped the purchases without care, and was clearly about to dismiss Lydia entirely when the door opened behind them. Sarah Hendricks swept in, the banker's wife, dressed in green silk despite the mud outside. Her eyes landed on Lydia and sharpened with something that looked like satisfaction. "Oh," she said, loud enough to carry. "Miss Moore. Still here, I see." "Mrs. Hendricks." Lydia kept her tone neutral. "I must say you've shown remarkable staying power. Most women in your position would have had the good sense to move on by now." Sarah smiled, sharp and bright. "But I suppose when one has nowhere else to go, one becomes less particular about appearances." The shop went very quiet. Lydia felt every eye on her, waiting to see how she'd respond, waiting to see if she'd crumble or fight or give them the scandal they were clearly hoping for. She thought about Thomas's hand steadying hers in the storm, thought about Clara and Sadie asleep in their beds, trusting her to be there when they woke, thought about 3 weeks of proving, to herself more than anyone, that she could stay, could build, could be more than the ash people saw when they looked at her. "You're right, Mrs. Hendricks," Lydia said quietly. "I don't have anywhere else to go. But I'm also not going anywhere. Thomas Reed offered me a place in his home, and his daughters want me there, and I've decided that their opinion matters more than yours." Sarah's smile faltered. "The scandal is only a scandal if you make it one. I'm helping raise 2 motherless girls and keeping house for a good man. If you see sin in that, perhaps you should examine your own conscience instead of mine." The words came out calmer than Lydia felt, firm without being aggressive. She picked up her parcels, met Sarah's eyes steadily, and waited. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, then turned on her heel and left in a rustle of expensive skirts. The shop stayed silent for 3 heartbeats. Then Mrs. Miller, surprising them both, let out a short laugh. "Well," she said, "that's been a long time coming." Lydia blinked. What?" "Sarah Hendricks has been running this town with her opinions for 5 years. High time someone told her where she could put them." Mrs. Miller's expression was still reserved, still cautious, but something had softened around the edges. "You need anything else, Miss Moore?" "No, thank you. This is plenty." "Then you have a good day, and—" Mrs. Miller hesitated, then pushed a small paper sack across the counter. "Peppermint sticks, for the Reed girls. No charge." It was a small kindness, barely a kindness at all. But it was the first crack in the town's solid wall of judgment, and Lydia took it like the gift it was. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. She walked home through mud and sunshine, her parcels balanced in her arms, the peppermint sticks safe in her pocket. And when she arrived to find the girls waiting on the porch, eager and worried and relieved all at once, she handed them the candy and watched their faces light up. "You came back," Sadie said, like she'd been afraid Lydia wouldn't. "Of course I came back," Lydia said. "This is home." Clara threw her arms around Lydia's waist, peppermint stick and all. "You told them, didn't you? Told them you're staying?" "I did." "Good," Clara said fiercely, "because you're ours, and they can't have you back." Later, after the girls had gone to bed full of peppermint and stories, Lydia told Thomas about the encounter in town. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "You stood up to Sarah Hendricks," he said when she finished. "I did. That took courage. Or foolishness. I may have just made everything harder." Thomas shook his head. "You drew a line, told the truth. There's nothing foolish about that." He was quiet for a moment, then, "This is going to get worse before it gets better. The talk, the judgment. They're going to push to see if you'll break." "I know." "And you're still staying?" Lydia met his eyes, steady and sure. "I'm still staying." Something in Thomas's expression shifted, some last wariness giving way to something that looked like trust. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes." "Whatever comes," Lydia agreed. And in the warm kitchen of a farmhouse that had weathered storms both literal and otherwise, Lydia Moore felt something she hadn't felt since before the fire. Certainty. Not that everything would be easy, not that the town would accept her, or the whispers would stop, or the judgment would fade overnight. But certainty that she'd chosen right, that staying was worth whatever came next. That home wasn't a place you found, it was a choice you made, day after day, storm after storm, until the choosing became as natural as breathing. She was home. Finally, impossibly, home. And this time she wasn't leaving. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday in the form of 3 men on horseback, their faces grim beneath hat brims, their purpose written in the set of their shoulders. Thomas was in the north field when they came, which meant Lydia was alone with the girls when the riders stopped at the gate and dismounted without invitation. She recognized 2 of them, Ezra Hendricks, the banker and Sarah's husband, and Marshall Pike, a man whose badge seemed to give him license to enforce opinions as readily as laws. The third was unfamiliar, older, with the kind of face that suggested he'd never smiled and didn't plan to start. Lydia stood on the porch, her hand steady on the railing despite the way her heart hammered. Behind her she could hear the girls go quiet, their play abandoned. "Miss Moore," Ezra Hendricks said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to speak with Thomas Reed. Is he available?" "He's working. Can I help you with something?" "This is a matter for the man of the house," the marshal said, his tone making it clear what he thought of Lydia's presence there. "Then you'll have to wait, because I'm not fetching him from the field for a conversation you haven't bothered to explain." Lydia kept her voice level, calm. "State your business or come back another time." The older man stepped forward, his eyes cold. "I'm Henry Dalton. I own the land adjacent to this property. Your arrangement here is causing concern among the community's decent families." "My arrangement," Lydia repeated carefully, "is that I keep house and help raise Mr. Reed's daughters. I fail to see how that concerns you or anyone else." "Don't play coy, woman. You're living in sin under this roof, and it's a disgrace to every God-fearing person in this territory." The words hit like a slap, but Lydia had been slapped before. With words, with judgment, with fire. She'd learned to stand through worse. "I have my own room. The girls are properly chaperoned. Mr. Reed has shown me nothing but respect, and I've done nothing to warrant your accusation or your presence on his property." "The appearance of impropriety is enough," the marshal said. "There are laws about public morality, Miss Moore, and there are ways to enforce them." It was a threat, thinly veiled. Lydia felt ice slide down her spine. Before she could respond, Clara pushed past her onto the porch, her small face set in lines of pure fury. "You leave her alone. She didn't do anything wrong." "Clara, inside," Lydia said quietly. "No, they're being mean, and you didn't do anything." "Inside, now. Take your sister." The command in Lydia's voice was something the girls had never heard before, sharp enough that Clara obeyed without argument, though her eyes blazed. Sadie followed, throwing one frightened look over her shoulder before disappearing into the house. Lydia waited until she heard the door close before speaking again. "You've made your point, gentlemen. Now I'll make mine. I'm not leaving, not because you disapprove, not because you've decided my presence here offends your sensibilities, not for any reason short of Thomas Reed asking me to go. And since he's the one who invited me to stay, I suggest you take your concerns to him directly, instead of coming here to intimidate a woman and frighten children." "This isn't a request," Henry Dalton said, his voice dropping low and mean. "This is a warning. Either you leave of your own accord, or we'll find legal means to remove you. Thomas Reed may be willing to risk his reputation, but we won't let him drag this community down with him." "And what legal means would those be?" The new voice came from behind the men, cold and sharp. Thomas stood at the fence line, his work shirt dark with sweat, his expression harder than Lydia had ever seen it. "Last I checked, a man's allowed to hire help on his own property. or have the laws changed without my knowing?" The three men turned. Ezra had the grace to look uncomfortable. The marshal simply looked annoyed. Henry Dalton's expression didn't change at all. "Thomas," Ezra said, his banker's voice smooth, "we're simply expressing community concern. Surely you understand how this looks. An unmarried woman living in your home. She's helping raise my daughters and keeping my household running. What part of that requires your approval?" "The part where decent people question what else might be happening under your roof," Henry said bluntly. Thomas's jaw tightened. For a moment, Lydia thought he might swing, might let the anger she could see coiling in his shoulders loose on these men who'd come onto his land to judge what they didn't understand. Instead, he smiled, thin and cold and utterly without humor. "My household is none of your business, Dalton. Neither is who I allow in my home or how I choose to live my life. You want to talk morality? Let's talk about how you bought the Henderson farm for half its value when drought drove them out. Or how Ezra's bank forecloses on struggling families while charging interest that would make a loan shark blush. You want to question my character? You'd best make sure yours stands up to the same scrutiny." "Now see here," Ezra started. "No, you see here." Thomas's voice was quiet but carried like thunder. "I've lived in this territory for 10 years, built this farm from scratch, raised crops, paid my debts, lost my wife to illness that your fine community did nothing to help with. I've asked for nothing from any of you, and now you come to my land, threaten someone under my protection, and dare to speak of morality?" "The law," the marshal began. "The law says a man can hire who he pleases, says nothing about needing permission from busybodies with too much time and too little sense." Thomas stepped closer to the fence, his eyes hard on each man in turn. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get on your horses. You're going to leave my property, and you're going to remember that whatever happens in my home is between me and mine. The next time you have concerns about my household, you can keep them to yourselves." "This isn't over," Henry said, his voice tight with anger. "It is until you have actual grounds to be here instead of gossip and spite." Thomas held his gaze until the older man looked away. "Now get off my land." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ezra cleared his throat, adjusted his hat, and walked back to his horse with as much dignity as he could muster. The marshal followed, his face set in a scowl that promised this wasn't finished. Henry Dalton held out longest, his eyes moving from Thomas to Lydia and back again. "You're making a mistake, Reed." "That's my privilege," Thomas said flatly, "just like leaving is yours." Henry mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, every movement calculated to show he wasn't being driven off, merely choosing to go. But he went, and the other two with him, dust rising from their horses' hooves as they rode back toward town. Thomas watched until they disappeared down the road before turning to the porch where Lydia still stood, her hands gripping the railing hard enough to hurt. "You all right?" he asked. Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. "The girls?" "Inside. Scared, probably." Thomas vaulted the fence with an ease that belied the tension still visible in every line of his body. He crossed to the porch in 3 strides, his eyes searching Lydia's face. "What did they say to you?" "What you heard. Mostly threats, accusations." She forced herself to release the railing, flexed her fingers. "I told them I wasn't leaving. That was dangerous. So was defending me. They'll make trouble for you now." "Let them try." Thomas's voice was still hard, still angry, but his hand when it touched her shoulder was gentle. "I meant what I said out there. You're under my protection. That means something. It means you've made enemies." "I've had enemies before. I'm still standing." Lydia looked at him. This quiet man who'd offered her shelter when no one else would, who'd defended her to powerful men with nothing to gain and everything to lose. "Why?" she asked. "Why fight for me?" "It would be easier to let me go, to find someone the town approves of." "Because you stayed when it was hard. Because my daughters love you. Because—" He stopped, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't ready to say. "Because you matter. To them. To me. And I don't give up things that matter just because someone else says I should." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to name. Lydia felt her throat tighten, felt the weight of being wanted, truly wanted, Not out of pity or convenience, but because someone had looked at all her broken pieces and decided they fit. I should check on the girls, she said quietly. Thomas nodded and stepped back, giving her space. I'll be in the barn if you need me. Need to think. She found Clara and Sadie huddled together on the stairs, their faces pale and frightened. They launched themselves at her the moment she appeared, wrapping small arms around her waist and middle like they could hold her there through sheer determination. Are you leaving? Sadie whispered. No. But those men said, those men don't decide what happens in this house. Your father does. And I do. And we've both decided I'm staying. Lydia stroked their hair, these two fierce girls who'd claimed her so completely. It might get harder before it gets easier. People might say mean things, but we're going to hold on to each other and hold on to what's true. Can you do that? Clara pulled back, her eyes swimming. What if they make you go? What if they find a law or something? Then we'll fight it, together. Lydia crouched down so she was eye level with both of them. Listen to me. I have been through fire. I have walked until my feet bled and been judged by people who didn't know my name. I have survived things that should have broken me. And you know what I learned? The only power anyone has over you is the power you give them. Those men can talk all they want, but they can't make me leave unless I choose to go, and I'm choosing to stay. Promise? Sadie's voice was so small, so full of a child's desperate need for certainty in an uncertain world. Lydia pulled them both close, held them tight. I promise. That night, after the girls were in bed and the house was quiet, Lydia found Thomas on the porch again, this time whittling a piece of wood with focused intensity. He didn't look up when she sat beside him, just kept his knife moving in smooth, practiced strokes. What are you making? She asked. Don't know yet. Just need my hands busy. They sat in silence while cicadas sang and the sky turned from blue to purple to black. Stars came out one by one, hard and bright in the summer heat. They're going to come back, Thomas said finally. Not tomorrow, maybe, but soon, with more pressure, more threats. Men like Dalton don't give up when they think they're right. I know. Could get ugly, could threaten the farm, my custody of the girls, everything I've built. I know that too. Thomas set down the wooden knife, turned to face her. Then you understand why I'm about to ask you something that's going to sound crazy. Lydia's heart kicked hard against her ribs. What? Marry me. The words hung in the night air, simple and impossible all at once. Thomas, not for romance, not for love, though He stopped, shook his head. This is about protection, legal protection. A wife has rights a housekeeper doesn't. Can't be forced to testify, can't be removed from the property without cause. Marry me and they can't touch you, can't threaten you or use you to get to me. That's not a reason to get married. It's a better reason than most people have. I've seen marriages built on less that lasted longer. His eyes were steady on hers, serious and sure. I'm not asking you to love me, Lydia. I'm asking you to let me keep you safe, to give those girls the mother they need and this household the legitimacy it deserves. Everything else, we'll figure it out as we go. It was possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of the territory. It was also the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. What about you? Lydia asked. What do you get out of this? You staying, the girl's happy, someone who doesn't run when things get hard. His voice softened. Someone who makes cornbread that doesn't taste like sadness. Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the sheer impossibility of what he was suggesting, Lydia laughed. It came out shaky and slightly hysterical, but it was real. You want to marry me for my cornbread? Among other things. Thomas reached out, took her scarred hand in his calloused one. I know this isn't what you imagined. I know I'm not offering flowers and poetry and all the things a woman should have when a man asks her to spend her life with him. But I can offer you safety, belonging, a home that's legally yours and children who already love you. And my word, my absolute word, that I will spend every day earning the trust you'd be giving me. Lydia looked down at their joined hands, his skin dark against hers, both marked by labor and survival and all the small violences of living. She thought about the girl she'd been before the fire, who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings. That girl was ash now, burned away by reality and hardship. But maybe that was all right. Maybe the woman who'd risen from those ashes, maybe she just needed truth and steadiness, and someone willing to fight for her when the world decided she wasn't worth keeping. The girls, she said, they should have a say. They already had their say when they brought you home from under that tree, but we can ask them in the morning if you want. And you're sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. The whole town will know. My reputation is already shot by having you here. Might as well make it official and legal while we're at it. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm sure, Lydia. Question is, are you? She should say no. Should tell him this was madness, that marriage shouldn't be entered into as a legal strategy, that there were 100 reasons why this wouldn't work. But she'd spent 3 months walking away from things, and she was tired, bone tired, of running. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. Thomas's smile was slow and genuine, reaching his eyes in a way she'd rarely seen. Yeah? Yeah. He lifted her hand, pressed a kiss to her scarred knuckles, gentle and reverent and completely unexpected. Then we'll do it right. Soon as we can arrange it, before Dalton and his friends can cause more trouble. How soon? This weekend if the circuit preacher's available. No point waiting and giving them time to scheme. 3 days. Lydia was going to be married in 3 days to a man she'd known for less than 2 months, in a ceremony that would be more business transaction than celebration. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something like relief. We should tell the girls in the morning, she said. We should. Thomas stood, pulled her up with him. Try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be busy. But sleep didn't come easy. Lydia lay in her small room staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around her. In 3 days, she'd be Lydia Reed, would have a legal right to the girls she already loved, to the home she'd already claimed, to the man who'd offered her safety when nowhere else would. It wasn't the life she'd imagined. It was better, stranger and harder and more real than any fantasy she'd constructed in younger, more innocent days. Morning came bright and hot, the kind of heat that promised to build all day. The girls were already up when Lydia came downstairs, helping their father make a catastrophic mess of breakfast. Eggs burned on the stove, coffee boiled over, and someone had apparently tried to make pancakes that now resembled leather. We thought we'd surprise you, Clara said, looking at the disaster with dismay. You certainly did that, Lydia said, moving to salvage what she could. How about you two set the table while I fix this? They obeyed with relief, chattering to each other while Lydia scraped burned eggs into the slop bucket and started fresh. Thomas leaned against the doorframe watching, his expression soft in the morning light. When they were all seated with food that was actually edible, Thomas cleared his throat. Girls, Lydia and I need to talk to you about something. 2 pairs of eyes went wide. Are you leaving? Sadie asked Lydia, fear immediate and sharp. No, the opposite, actually. Lydia reached across the table, took each small hand in hers. Your father asked me to marry him, and I said yes. For a moment there was perfect silence. Then Clara's face split into a grin so wide it looked painful, and Sadie burst into tears, happy ones, from the way she was laughing while crying. Really? Clara demanded. You're going to be our real ma? If you'll have me. Yes! Both girls launched themselves from their seats, scrambling around the table to throw their arms around Lydia. Yes, yes, yes! Thomas watched them with an expression that was equal parts relief and something deeper, something that looked like contentment. We're thinking this weekend, quick ceremony, just us and whoever needs to be there to make it legal. Can we have new dresses? Clara asked, practical even in her excitement. We'll see what we can manage. And cake? Ma always said weddings needed cake. We'll make sure there's cake, Lydia promised, her throat tight. The girls peppered them with questions through the rest of breakfast. What would they wear? Where would they have the ceremony? Could they invite anyone? Would Lydia move into Pa's room, or would Pa move into hers? What should they call her now? Thomas fielded most of it with patience, though Lydia caught him looking at her more than once with something that might have been wonder, or might have been gratitude, or might have been both. After breakfast, while Thomas went to town to make arrangements with the preacher, Lydia took the girls out to the garden. They worked in companionable silence for a while, weeding and watering before Sadie spoke up. Are you scared? She asked. Lydia sat back on her heels, considered the question. A little. Marriage is a big step. But you love Pa, right? And you love us? Love. They'd never said the word out loud, any of them. It hung in the air now, unavoidable. I do, Lydia said softly. I do love you both. Very much. And your father... She paused, trying to find words for something she hadn't fully named to herself. Your father is a good man. The best man I've known. Whether that's love or something that will grow into love, I don't know yet. But I know I want to be here, with all of you, for as long as you'll have me. Forever then, Clara said matter-of-factly. Because we're never letting you go. Sadie leaned against Lydia's shoulder, small and warm and trusting. You're already ours anyway. The wedding just makes it official. Out of the mouths of children came truth so simple it hurt. Lydia pulled them both close, these girls who'd chosen her first, who'd looked at a broken woman under a tree and seen possibility instead of ash. Yeah, she whispered. It makes it official. Thomas returned from town in the afternoon with news that the circuit preacher could perform the ceremony on Saturday, 2 days away. He'd also brought fabric for the girls to make new dresses, though his choices were hilariously impractical. Thomas, this is velvet, Lydia said, holding up a bolt of deep blue fabric. In summer, in this heat. He looked genuinely confused. But it's pretty. It's also going to make them sweat through their undergarments in about 5 minutes. Oh. He glanced at the other fabric, a yellow silk that would show every speck of dirt. I might not be good at this. You're terrible at this, Lydia agreed, but she was smiling. Go back and get cotton, something light, and while you're there, pick up whatever you need for yourself. I assume you're not getting married in work clothes? I have a suit. Wore it to my first wedding. Still fits. The mention of his first wedding should have been awkward, should have reminded them both that this was his second chance and her first, and neither quite knew what they were doing. Instead, it just felt honest, like everything else between them. That night they sat up late making plans. Who to invite? Just a few neighbors, the ones who hadn't turned their backs. What food to prepare? Simple but good, nothing fancy. Where to hold it? The house, with the ceremony on the porch, if weather permitted. It was practical and unromantic and somehow exactly right. No flowers, Lydia said. Too expensive and they'll wilt in the heat anyway. The girls can pick wildflowers if they want, plenty growing by the creek. And I'll wear my good dress, the blue one. Your mother's dress. She told him one night about the blue dress, about how the girls had altered it to fit her, about how wearing it felt like being accepted into something she'd never quite believed she deserved. Unless you'd rather I didn't, I'd rather you did, Thomas said firmly. She'd have wanted that, wanted you to have it, to wear it, to be the mother her girls need. The word settled something in Lydia's chest, some last hesitation about whether she was replacing something irreplaceable or building something new. Thank you. For what? For making this feel right. For not making me feel like I'm taking something that wasn't mine to take. Thomas reached across the table, covered her hand with his. You're not taking anything, Lydia. You're giving. Giving those girls a mother. Giving me a partner. Giving this house life again. That's not replacement. That's grace. In 2 days, she would marry this man who spoke truth like breathing, who offered protection without asking for anything in return, who defended her to powerful men because he'd decided she mattered. In 2 days, she would become Lydia Reed, wife and mother and woman who'd stopped running. In 2 days, everything would change. Or maybe it already had, the moment she'd said yes to 2 barefoot girls under a cottonwood tree. Maybe the wedding was just making visible what had already become true through shared meals and storm-weathered nights and all the small choices that built a family from scattered pieces. I should sleep, she said. Big day coming. Yeah. But Thomas didn't let go of her hand immediately. Lydia? I know this isn't conventional. I know I'm asking you to take a leap on not much more than faith, but I promise you, I'll do everything I can to make this work, to make you glad you stayed. I'm already glad, she said honestly. The rest we'll figure out together. His smile was quiet and sure. Together. Saturday morning arrived with clouds building on the horizon, gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Lydia woke before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves she hadn't expected. In a few hours, she would stand before a preacher and promise herself to a man she'd known for less than 2 months. It should have felt reckless. Instead, it felt inevitable, like every choice since walking into this town had led here, to this moment, to this transformation from wanderer to wife. She dressed carefully in the blue calico, her fingers fumbling with buttons until she forced them steady. The girls were already awake. She could hear them giggling in their room, high and excited. Thomas's door was closed, which meant he was likely awake too, probably as nervous as she was, though he'd never admit it. Downstairs, the kitchen was clean and ready. They'd prepared what they could the night before. A simple cake cooling in the pantry, bread baked and waiting, a pot of beans that just needed heating. Nothing fancy, but enough to feed the handful of neighbors who'd agreed to come. Mrs. Miller had surprised them by offering to bring preserves and butter. Old Jacob Chen, who ran the livery, had promised venison from his recent hunt. Small kindnesses from unexpected sources, proof that not everyone in town had decided Lydia was unworthy. She was making coffee when Thomas appeared, already dressed in his wedding suit. It was black wool, slightly moth-eaten at the cuffs, the jacket tight across shoulders that had broadened since his first marriage. But he'd shaved clean and combed his hair back with water, and there was something almost vulnerable in how carefully he'd prepared himself. "You look good," Lydia said. "You look better." His eyes moved over her, not with hunger but with something deeper, appreciation, maybe, or wonder that she was really here, really staying. "The dress suits you." The girls did a good job with the alterations. They did. He poured himself coffee, his movements careful, deliberate. "Sleep at all?" "Some. You?" "Not much." He leaned against the counter, cup warming his hands. "Kept thinking about what I'm promising you today. What you're giving up by saying yes." "I'm not giving up anything." "You're giving up the chance to find someone better. Someone who—" He stopped, jaw working. Lydia set down her own cup, crossed to him. "Thomas Reed, you listen to me. I have had months to find somewhere else to be, someone else to choose. I'm standing here in a wedding dress about to marry you because this is exactly where I want to be. Not because I have no other options, but because no other options matter. You and those girls, you're what I choose, so stop trying to talk me out of it." His smile came slow and genuine, reaching his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now drink your coffee and help me figure out how to keep this cake from falling apart in the heat." The girls thundered downstairs moments later, wearing their new dresses, simple cotton in pale green that made their eyes bright and their sun-browned skin glow. They'd braided each other's hair and woven wildflowers through the plaits, black-eyed Susans and prairie clover, stems still wet from the creek. "We picked enough for you too," Sadie said, holding out a handful of flowers. Lydia knelt so they could weave the stems through her own braid, their small fingers gentle and sure. When they finished, she looked at Thomas and saw something shift in his expression, not desire exactly, but recognition, like he was seeing for the first time what they were about to become, a family, formal and legal and real. The neighbors started arriving around 10. Mrs. Miller first, bringing the promised preserves along with her husband, a quiet man who nodded to Thomas with something like respect. Jacob Chen came with the venison already roasted and still warm, his weathered face creasing in a smile when the girls greeted him with enthusiasm. A few others trickled in, farmers Thomas had helped during hard seasons, a widow who'd received firewood from him last winter, people who measured character by action instead of gossip. Sarah Hendricks and her husband were notably absent. So was Marshall Pike. So was Henry Dalton and most of the town's so-called respectable families. But the dozen or so people who came filled the house with warmth and well wishes, and that felt like more than enough. The circuit preacher arrived at 11, a thin man named Reverend Walsh, who'd been traveling these territories for 30 years and had seen every kind of wedding imaginable. He shook Thomas's hand, smiled at Lydia without judgment, and asked if they were ready. "As we'll ever be," Thomas said. They gathered on the porch as planned, the wedding party small and intimate. Thomas stood beside Lydia, the girls between them, their small hands clutching flowers. The assembled neighbors formed a semicircle, and Reverend Walsh opened his worn Bible with hands that shook slightly from age or perhaps just the weight of what he was witnessing. Two wounded people choosing to build something whole. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "We are gathered here in the sight of this community to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted." The words washed over Lydia, familiar liturgy she'd heard at other weddings, promises made by people who'd known each other their whole lives, who'd courted properly and planned futures with certainty. This wasn't that. This was survival and choice, and two people deciding that together was better than alone. But when Reverend Walsh asked, "Thomas Reed, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Thomas's voice was clear and sure. "I do." The Reverend turned to Lydia. "Lydia Moore, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Lydia looked at Thomas, at his gray eyes steady on hers, at the set of his jaw that said he meant every word of what he'd promised, at the life he was offering her with both hands. She thought about the woman she'd been walking into this town, hollow and certain of nothing. Thought about the woman she'd become in these few short weeks, stronger, steadier, sure of at least one thing. "I do," she said. Thomas produced a ring, simple gold, slightly worn, his first wife's ring, Lydia realized, and felt something tighten in her chest. He slid it onto her finger with hands that were almost steady. "I give you this ring as a symbol of my vow," he said, the traditional words. "With all that I am and all that I have, I honor you." Reverend Walsh smiled. "Walsh. Then by the power vested in me by this territory and under the eyes of these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." Thomas hesitated. They hadn't discussed this part, hadn't practiced or planned. Then he stepped close, cupped her face with calloused hands, and kissed her with a gentleness that made her breath catch. It was chaste and brief, and somehow more meaningful than any passionate embrace, a promise sealed with simple contact. When he pulled back, his thumb brushed her cheek. "Hello, Mrs. Reed." "Hello, husband," she whispered back. The girls erupted in cheers, throwing their wildflowers in the air. The neighbors clapped and called congratulations. And Lydia Reed now, legally and truly, felt tears slip down her face for the first time since the fire. But these were different. These weren't grief or fear or the bitter salt of loss. These were relief. These were joy. These were the tears of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side to find home waiting. The celebration that followed was simple and sweet. They ate roasted venison and fresh bread, preserves spread thick on still warm slices. The cake, which had indeed threatened to fall apart in the heat, held together long enough to be cut and served. Someone produced a fiddle, and music filled the afternoon as neighbors danced on the packed dirt of the yard. Thomas danced with each of his daughters first, spinning them until they shrieked with laughter. Then he came for Lydia, offering his hand with a small bow that was almost playful. "I'm not much of a dancer," he warned. "Neither am I," Lydia admitted. But they moved together in the dusty yard while the fiddle sang, and their neighbors watched with approval instead of judgment, and it didn't matter that neither of them knew the steps perfectly. What mattered was that they were learning together, adjusting to each other's rhythm, finding balance in motion. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, his mouth close to her ear. "For saying yes, for staying, for all of it. Thank you for asking." Lydia rested her head briefly against his shoulder, breathed in the smell of him, soap and sun and honest sweat. "For fighting for me, for making me believe I deserve to be fought for. You do. You always did." His arms tightened around her. "The rest of the town will come around eventually, and if they don't, well, we've got everything we need right here." He was wrong about that, Lydia would discover. The town didn't come around. If anything, the wedding made things worse. The trouble started on Monday when the marriage license was filed, the deed updated to include her name, every legal protection in place. She was Mrs. Thomas Reed now, with all the rights and respectability that should have entailed. But when she walked into Miller's general store, the conversations didn't just stop. They turned hostile. Women she'd never met glared with open disgust. Men smirked and whispered behind their hands. And when she approached the counter, Mrs. Miller, who'd brought preserves to the wedding just 2 days before, wouldn't meet her eyes. "I need flour," Lydia said quietly, "and sugar, and thread if you have the heavy kind." Mrs. Miller measured out the supplies in silence, her movements jerky. When Lydia reached for her purse, the shopkeeper shook her head. "Can't sell to you." Lydia's hand froze. "What?" "Can't sell to you," Mrs. Miller repeated, still not looking up. "My husband's orders. Says we can't do business with your household anymore." "But you came to the wedding, That was before." Mrs. Miller finally met her eyes, and Lydia saw fear there, not malice. "Before the town council met. Before they made it clear that anyone doing business with you would lose their standing. I'm sorry, Mrs. Reed, I truly am, but I can't afford to cross them." The words hit like a physical blow. Lydia looked around the store, at the other shoppers watching with varying degrees of satisfaction or pity, at the supplies she needed sitting on the counter, at the complete collapse of the small progress she'd thought they'd made. "I see," she said quietly. "Then I'll take my money elsewhere." "There is nowhere else," someone said from the back of the store. Lydia turned to find Henry Dalton leaning against a shelf, his expression smug. "Every business in town has agreed. You want supplies? You'll have to travel to the next county. That's a 2-day trip, if the weather holds. Quite inconvenient for a woman with a household to run." Rage flared hot and bright in Lydia's chest, but she kept her voice level. "This is illegal. You can't force businesses to refuse service." "We're not forcing anything," Dalton said smoothly. "Just expressing community standards. Merchants have the right to refuse service to anyone, especially to those who offend public morality. I'm married, legally married. There's no morality to offend. A hasty marriage arranged to cover sin doesn't erase the sin itself." He pushed off the shelf, moved closer. "You think you've won, Mrs. Reed? You think a piece of paper changes what you are? You're still a homeless woman who manipulated a widower and his children, still someone who brings shame to this community, and we're going to make sure you understand exactly how unwelcome you are." Lydia wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, wanted to demand justice from a system she knew was rigged against her. Instead, she gathered what dignity she had left and walked out of the store with her head high and her purse still heavy because no one would take her money. She made it to the edge of town before the shaking started. Made it to the cottonwood tree where this had all begun before her knees gave out and she sank down, pressing her palms against the earth to ground herself. They were going to starve her out, cut off her supplies until Thomas had no choice but to send her away or watch his family suffer. It was cruel and calculating and perfectly legal, as long as the merchants claimed it was their choice and not coercion. "Lydia?" She looked up to find Jacob Chen standing over her, concern etched deep in his weathered face. He held a burlap sack in one hand. "Heard what happened at Miller's," he said. "Figured you might need some help." He set the sack down beside her. Inside were flour, sugar, beans, coffee, basic supplies. Not much, but enough. "I can't pay you if no one will sell to me," Lydia said, her voice rough. "Didn't ask for payment. Consider it a wedding gift, late." Jacob squatted down, his knees creaking. "Listen to me. Most of this town is made up of cowards who'd rather bow to Dalton and his friends than stand up for what's right. But there's a few of us who remember what it means to help neighbors, who remember that Thomas Reed has never turned away anyone who needed it, and his wife deserves the same courtesy. Jacob, I can't do much. Can't openly defy the council, or I'll lose my business same as Miller might. But I can make sure you don't starve, can make sure others who think like me do the same." He stood, his expression fierce despite his age. "You're not alone in this, Mrs. Reed. Don't forget that." He was gone before Lydia could thank him, melting back toward town like he'd never been there. She picked up the sack, felt the weight of it, both the physical supplies and the emotional support it represented, and felt something settle in her chest. They could make her unwelcome. They could refuse to sell to her, could whisper and judge and try to starve her out, but they couldn't make her leave. Not anymore. She was Lydia Reed now, with a legal right to her home and her family, and she'd survived worse than small-town cruelty. She'd survived fire. She could survive this. Thomas was in the barn when she got home, repairing a stall gate. He took one look at her face and set down his tools. What happened? She told him, watched his expression go from concern to fury to something cold and calculating that was somehow more frightening than rage. They can't do this, he said when she finished. They already did. Then we'll go to the territorial marshal, file a complaint. The marshal is friends with Dalton, you know that. Lydia set down the sack Jacob had given her. This is what they wanted all along. They couldn't force me out legally, so they're making it impossible for me to stay practically. Thomas paced the barn, his hands flexing like he wanted to hit something. There has to be something we can do. Some way to fight this. There is. We survive it. Lydia caught his arm, made him look at her. Thomas, listen. They want us to react, to fight, to give them an excuse to take more drastic action. But we're not going to do that. We're going to be smart. Jacob gave us supplies. There will be others. Quiet support from people who can't openly defy the council, but won't stand by and watch us starve. We plant a bigger garden. We preserve everything we can. We make ourselves as self-sufficient as possible. That's not a solution. That's surrender. No, surrender is leaving. This is survival. She moved closer, put her hands on his chest where she could feel his heart hammering. I'm not giving them the satisfaction of running me off. Neither are you. We're going to stay, and we're going to make this work. And eventually they'll realize we're not going anywhere, and they'll have to adjust. And if they don't adjust? If they keep pushing until we have nothing left? Lydia thought about the fire, about walking 3 months with nothing, about learning that survival was sometimes just the act of refusing to quit, even when quitting made sense. Then we'll have each other. And that's more than most people ever get. Thomas pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her like he could shield her from the town's cruelty through sheer determination. I'm sorry. I brought you into this, made you a target. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to stop walking. Lydia pressed her face into his shoulder. Whatever comes next, we face it together. That's what marriage means, right? Better or worse, richer or poorer. We just got the worse and poorer part sooner than most. His laugh was short and bitter, but real. Guess we did. That night they sat down with the girls and explained the situation in terms they could understand. Yes, some people in town were being unkind. Yes, it might be harder to get supplies for a while. No, it didn't mean they were leaving or giving up. It just meant they had to be smart and careful and rely on each other. Claire took it with characteristic pragmatism. So we can't go to town? You can, Thomas said, but you might hear things, mean things, and I need you both to remember that what people say doesn't change what's true. What's true is you and Lydia are married and we're a family, Sadie said firmly, and anyone who doesn't like it can, she glanced at Lydia, can go sit on a cactus. Despite everything, Lydia smiled. Exactly right. The next few weeks were harder than Lydia wanted to admit. Supplies came sporadically. Jacob Chen leaving things at the property line when he could, Mrs. Miller slipping small packages of thread and needles through intermediaries, a few other brave souls defying the council's implicit ban. But it was unpredictable and insufficient, and Lydia found herself rationing flour, watering down coffee, making one chicken stretch across 3 meals. The garden helped. So did Thomas's hunting. They had eggs from the chickens, milk from the cows, vegetables they preserved in every way they knew how. It wasn't starvation, but it was lean, and Lydia watched the girls' dresses get a little looser and felt guilt gnaw at her constantly. This is my fault, she said one night as she and Thomas worked side by side preserving tomatoes. It's Dalton's fault, and the council's, and every person in that town who decided their pride mattered more than decency. Thomas didn't look up from his work. Don't take on blame that isn't yours to carry. But if you hadn't stayed, my daughters would still be grieving. I'd still be burning every meal, and this house would still feel empty enough to echo. He set down his knife, turned to face her. Lydia, you think I don't know what you gave up to be here? You could have kept walking, could have found a town that didn't know your history, could have started over somewhere easier, but you chose this, chose us, knowing it would be hard. That's not something to apologize for. That's something to be proud of. Lydia wanted to believe him. Some days she almost did. Other days she woke up aching with hunger she wouldn't admit and wondered if stubbornness was really the same thing as strength, or if she was just too tired to know the difference anymore. Then came the day Clara got sick. It started small, a cough, a slight fever, nothing alarming. Lydia gave her willow bark tea and kept her in bed, expecting it to pass. But the fever climbed instead of breaking, and the cough developed into something wet and rattling that made Lydia's blood run cold. Pneumonia, the same thing that had killed the girl's mother. "We need a doctor," Lydia said, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Thomas stood over Clara's bed, his face gray. "Doc Warren won't come. He's part of the council." "Then we'll go to him, carry her to town if we have to." "Lydia, I don't care what it costs. I don't care what they think or say or do. We're getting her help." Her voice broke. "Thomas, we're not losing her. We're not." He looked at his daughter, small and flushed and struggling to breathe, and nodded. "Get her ready. I'll hitch the wagon." They arrived in town just after noon, Thomas carrying Clara wrapped in a quilt, Lydia at his side with Sadie's hand gripped tight in hers. People stared as they passed, but for once Lydia didn't care. Let them stare. Let them judge. Her daughter was dying, and nothing else mattered. Dr. Warren's office was on Main Street, a tidy building with a painted sign. Thomas kicked the door open without knocking, and they found the doctor at his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up, saw them, and his expression closed. "I can't help you." "My daughter is dying," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're going to help her. I'm under strict orders from the council not to provide services to your household." Thomas set Clara down in the examination chair with heartbreaking gentleness, then crossed to the doctor's desk in 2 strides. He didn't shout, didn't raise a hand, just leaned in close and spoke with the kind of cold fury that was more terrifying than rage. "You're a doctor. You took an oath to help the sick. That little girl has done nothing wrong except be born to a man you disapprove of. Now you're going to examine her. You're going to tell me what's wrong. And you're going to give me what I need to treat her, or I'm going to make sure everyone in this territory knows that Doc Warren let a child die because of politics. See how that sits with your conscience and your business." The threat hung in the air, sharp and real. Lydia held her breath. Sadie pressed against her side. Dr. Warren looked at Clara, at her fever-bright eyes and labored breathing, and something in his expression shifted. Not to kindness exactly, but to professional duty that overrode personal prejudice. "Fine," he said shortly, "but only because I won't have a child's death on my hands." He examined Clara with efficient, impersonal thoroughness, listened to her lungs, checked her throat, took her temperature. When he finished, he pulled Thomas aside, but Lydia followed, refusing to be excluded. "Pneumonia," Warren confirmed, his voice low. "Early stages, but serious. She needs rest, fluids, and this." He wrote out a prescription. "It's a tincture. Give her a teaspoon every 4 hours. Keep her cool and quiet. If the fever doesn't break in 3 days, bring her back." "Will she—" Thomas couldn't finish the question. "She's young and otherwise healthy. With proper care, she should recover." Warren handed over the prescription and a small bottle. "This should last a few days. After that I'll figure something out," Thomas said. "How much do I owe you?" Warren named a price that was clearly inflated. Punishment for forcing his hand. Thomas paid without argument, gathered Clara back into his arms, and left without thanks. They got the tincture at the pharmacy, another hostile transaction, another inflated price, and drove home in silence. Clara dozed fitfully against Thomas's chest. Sadie cried quietly in Lydia's lap, and Lydia felt something harden inside her, some last soft place calcifying into pure determination. The town wanted a war? Fine. They'd have one. But Lydia wasn't fighting for pride anymore. She was fighting for her family, and she would burn the whole territory to the ground before she let them take her children. Clara's fever broke on the 3rd day, just as dawn light was spilling through the bedroom window. Lydia had been awake all night, sponging the girl's forehead with cool water, counting breaths, willing her to keep fighting. When Clara's eyes finally opened, clear instead of fever-glazed, and she whispered, "I'm thirsty," Lydia had to press her fist to her mouth to keep from sobbing with relief. Thomas appeared in the doorway moments later, looking haggard from his own vigil. "She's better?" "She's asking for water," Lydia said, and watched the tension drain from his shoulders like someone had cut strings. Sadie pushed past her father to climb carefully onto the bed, wrapping herself around her sister with the fierce protectiveness of a child who'd almost lost something precious. "You scared us," she whispered. "Don't do that again." "Didn't mean to," Clara said, her voice weak but steady. "What did I miss?" "Everything boring," Sadie assured her. "Lydia made us eat vegetables 3 times a day, and Pa wouldn't let me go outside, and it was awful." Despite the exhaustion, despite the fear that still sat heavy in Lydia's chest, she smiled. This ordinary squabbling, this simple proof of life continuing, this was what they'd fought for, what they'd keep fighting for, no matter what the town threw at them. Over the next week, as Clara recovered, Lydia made plans. She cataloged every skill she had, every resource at their disposal, every possible way to make the farm more self-sufficient. Thomas plowed 2 more acres for vegetables. Lydia started preserving everything she could: pickles, jams, dried beans, salted meat. They couldn't control what the town did, but they could control how well they prepared for siege. Jacob Chen appeared one evening just after sunset, his wagon loaded with supplies he claimed were surplus from the livery: coffee, flour, sugar, even some fabric and needles. He refused payment, refused thanks, just unloaded everything into their barn and left with a nod that said more than words could. 2 days later, Mrs. Miller's daughter, a girl of maybe 16, appeared at the door with a basket of thread, buttons, and lace. "Ma says she's sorry," the girl said, not quite meeting Lydia's eyes. "Says she knows it's not enough, but she wanted you to have these. For the girls." Lydia took the basket with shaking hands. "Tell your mother thank you. And tell her I understand. Fear makes us all smaller than we want to be." The girl nodded and left quickly, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid of being seen. They weren't the only ones. Over the following days, small gifts appeared, always at night, always anonymous. A sack of oats left by the fence, fresh eggs in a basket at the back door. Once, inexplicably, a whole smoked ham wrapped in burlap. The town's silent minority, making their position known through quiet defiance. It wasn't enough to live on, not quite, but it was enough to survive. Enough to prove that Dalton and his council didn't speak for everyone, no matter how loudly they proclaimed their moral authority. Then came the meeting. The notice appeared on the church door one Sunday morning, an emergency town assembly to discuss matters of public concern. Lydia saw it when she rode into town alone. Needing to check on supplies Jacob had promised to leave at the livery. She stood reading the formal language that didn't quite hide its true purpose. They were going to try to force Thomas to choose between his farm and his wife. She rode home faster than was safe, found Thomas in the field, and told him. He listened without expression, then set down his hoe. "When?" "Tonight, 7 o'clock. "Then we'll be there." "Thomas, they're going to make demands. Threaten the farm, maybe custody of the girls. Then we'll face it." His voice was calm, but his eyes were storm gray and hard. "I'm done hiding, done letting them dictate how we live. If they want a confrontation, they'll get one, but it won't end the way they expect." That evening, the 4 of them dressed carefully. Sunday clothes, pressed and proper, armor made of respectability. The girls were quiet, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. Thomas helped Lydia into the wagon with formal courtesy, and they rode into town as the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. The church was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, the air thick with anticipation and judgment. Conversations died as the Reed family entered. Eyes tracked them, hostile, curious, pitying, as they walked down the center aisle to the only empty pew, right in front. Henry Dalton stood at the pulpit like he was preaching salvation instead of persecution. Ezra Hendricks sat beside him, along with Marshall Pike and 3 other council members Lydia recognized but couldn't name. The town's power structure, arrayed in judgment, Dalton waited until they were seated, until the silence was complete and uncomfortable, before speaking. We're here tonight to address a situation that has been troubling this community for some time now. The presence of Lydia Reed, in Thomas Reed's household has been a source of scandal and moral concern since the day she arrived. Lydia felt every eye on her but kept her gaze steady on Dalton. We've tried to be patient, he continued, tried to give Mr. Reed the benefit of the doubt, to assume he would come to his senses and recognize the damage being done to his reputation and that of his children. But patience has its limits. The hasty marriage arranged to legitimize this situation has only made matters worse, showing a clear disregard for propriety and community standards. What exactly are you proposing, Dalton? Thomas's voice cut through the speech, cold and level. Dalton's smile was thin. A solution. The council is prepared to offer you financial assistance to relocate Mrs. Reed to appropriate accommodations in another town. We'll cover travel expenses, 3 months' rent, even a small stipend to help her get established. In exchange, you agree to annul the marriage and ensure she no longer resides in this territory. The church erupted in murmurs, some approving, some shocked. Lydia sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and felt Thomas's arm come around her shoulders. No, he said simply. Mr. Reed, be reasonable. Think of your daughters, of their future in this community. The stigma of having a woman of questionable character as their stepmother, questionable character. Thomas stood, and the church went quiet. You want to question character, Henry? Let's talk about yours, about how you acquired the Henderson farm through predatory lending, about the 3 families you've driven off land they'd worked for generations, about the way you use the council as your personal weapon against anyone who won't bow to your authority. Dalton's face flushed dark. That's slander. It's documented fact. I've got deeds, loan papers, letters from families you've ruined, been collecting them for months, ever since you started making threats. You want to bring my wife's character into question in front of this town? Fine. But your own won't survive the scrutiny. The murmurs grew louder. Lydia saw several council members exchange uncomfortable glances. Ezra Hendricks looked particularly pale. This is not about me, Dalton said, recovering his composure. This is about protecting this community from moral degradation. Mrs. Reed arrived here with nothing, no references, no past, no explanation for the burns she carries or the circumstances that left her homeless. For all we know, she's running from the law, from debts, from crimes she committed elsewhere. And you expect us to simply accept her into our town without question? I expect you to show Christian charity, Thomas shot back. I expect you to judge people by their actions instead of their circumstances. Lydia has done nothing but help my family, contribute to my household, and try to live quietly despite constant harassment. What crime is that? The crime of deception, of manipulation, of using a man's grief and children's need to secure herself a position she hasn't earned. That's enough. Lydia stood, and the surprise of it, the quiet woman finally speaking, silenced the room completely. You want to know about me, Mr. Dalton? About my past and my scars and why I arrived here with nothing? Fine, I'll tell you. Thomas touched her arm. Lydia, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She moved past him into the aisle, facing the congregation, facing judgment she'd run from for months, deciding finally the truth was the only weapon she had left. My name is Lydia Moore. I was born in Pennsylvania, orphaned at 12, worked in boarding houses and private homes until I was 26. I was employed at the Brennan House in Salton when a fire started in the kitchen. She held up her scarred hands so everyone could see. I got these trying to save Mrs. Brennan from the flames, went back into a burning building to pull her out. She died anyway, 3 days later. The town blamed me, said I must have started it through carelessness, that I was responsible for her death. Insurance wouldn't pay. I lost my job, my home, my reputation, everything. The church was silent as a grave. Lydia's voice stayed steady. I walked for 3 months looking for work, for somewhere that would take me despite the rumors that followed. Every door closed, every town turned me away. I was sleeping under a tree, half dead from heat and hunger, when Mr. Reed's daughters found me. They brought me to their home. Their father offered me food, shelter, a chance to prove I was more than my worst moment, and I took it. She turned to look at Thomas. at the girl sitting wide-eyed in the pew. I took it because I was desperate, because I had nowhere else to go. But I stayed because I found something here worth fighting for. A family that needed me as much as I needed them. Children who deserved better than to keep grieving. A good man who'd forgotten what it felt like to have help carrying the weight. Turning back to the congregation, Lydia drew herself up straight. You want to judge me for that? For accepting kindness when it was offered? For choosing to stay when I could have kept running? Then judge. But know that everything I've done since arriving here has been in service to that family. I've cooked, cleaned, mended, comforted, protected. I've turned this man's house back into a home and given those girls a mother who will fight for them until her last breath. If that's a crime in your eyes, then I'm guilty. And I'm not sorry for it. The silence stretched. Then someone in the back started clapping, slow, deliberate. Lydia turned to see Jacob Chen standing, his weathered face set in approval. Others joined him. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Mrs. Miller and her daughter. The widow who'd received firewood. Farmers Thomas had helped. The town's quiet minority finally finding voice. Dalton's face went purple with rage. This doesn't change anything. The council has made its decision. The council doesn't speak for this town. The new voice came from the side aisle. Reverend Walsh, the circuit preacher who'd married them, stepped forward. I've been riding this territory for 30 years, and I've seen every kind of marriage, every kind of family. Some start with love, some start with need, some start with nothing but hope and determination. What matters isn't how they start, it's how they endure. He moved to stand beside Lydia and Thomas. I married these two. Watch them make vows before witnesses. Those vows are legal and binding, and no town council has the authority to dissolve them. Mrs. Reed is exactly what she claims, a woman who found a family and chose to stay. If that offends your sense of propriety, gentlemen, then perhaps you need to examine your own hearts instead of hers. Reverend, surely you can see. What I see is a community more interested in control than compassion, more concerned with appearances than with actual morality. Walsh's voice carried the weight of 3 decades traveling hard territories, seeing humanity at its best and worst. You want to make demands? Here's mine. Leave this family alone. Stop harassing them. Stop cutting off their supplies. Stop using your positions to punish people for the crime of surviving. Or I'll make it my mission to ensure every preacher, every circuit rider, every traveling minister knows exactly what kind of Christian charity this town practices. The threat landed hard. In territories where preachers were scarce and respect for the church ran deep, Walsh's condemnation could destroy reputations more effectively than any scandal. Dalton opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his fellow council members. They offered no support, several actively looking away. The town had spoken, not unanimously, but loudly enough. The council's power, built on collective compliance, was cracking. This meeting is adjourned, Dalton said finally, his voice tight. But mark my words, Reed, this isn't over. Yeah, it is, Thomas said quietly. You just haven't accepted it yet. They left the church together, Thomas, Lydia, and the girls, walking through a congregation that parted with varying degrees of respect, hostility, and thoughtful silence. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, stars bright overhead. That was brave, Thomas said once they were in the wagon. Standing up like that, telling the truth. I'm tired of hiding, Lydia said, tired of being ashamed of surviving. Whatever comes next, at least it'll be honest. What came next was subtle at first. Miller's General Store started selling to them again. Quietly, without fanfare, Mrs. Miller meeting Lydia's eyes with something like respect. Other businesses followed, not all at once, but gradually, the unofficial ban crumbling under the weight of its own cruelty. Doc Warren sent word through Jacob that he'd provide medical care if needed, free of charge, his way of apologizing for making them beg. Henry Dalton tried to maintain his boycott, tried to rally the faithful to his cause. But the town had grown weary of his moral crusades, had seen too clearly the difference between protecting standards and wielding power. When his own business started suffering, farmers choosing to sell their goods elsewhere, families finding other ways to manage their money, he backed down with bitter grace, though his hatred never quite disappeared. The Reed household settled into something that resembled normal. Claire recovered fully, running wild with her sister through late summer fields. Thomas's crops came in strong, enough to sell, to store, to finally breathe easier about winter. And Lydia. Lydia learned to walk through town without flinching, to hold her head high when people stared, to believe that maybe she'd earned her place through perseverance instead of luck. The marriage remained practical in most ways. Thomas kept his room, Lydia kept hers, their partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than romance. But there were moments, his hand finding hers during church services, the way he said her name like it mattered, the morning she woke to find he'd fixed the loose floorboard in her room without being asked. That suggested something deeper growing in the spaces between obligation and choice. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the girls chase fireflies, Thomas spoke quietly. "You ever regret it? Staying here, marrying me, taking on all this trouble?" Lydia considered the question honestly, thought about the hunger, the fear, the constant battle to prove herself worthy of basic human dignity, thought about Clara's fever, about standing before a hostile congregation, about every hard moment since walking into this town. "No," she said finally. "This is the first place I've felt like myself since the fire. The first place where I'm more than what happened to me." "You were always more than that," Thomas said. "Just took you a while to see it." She looked at him, this quiet, steady man who'd offered shelter when no one else would, who'd fought for her when fighting made no sense, who'd given her time and space to become someone worth fighting for. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." His smile was small and genuine. Partners see each other. That's how it works. Partners. Not husband and wife in the traditional sense, but something equally valuable. Something built on foundation strong enough to weather storms, both literal and social. As summer faded into fall, the Reed household established rhythms that felt permanent. Lydia taught the girls to preserve vegetables, to sew their own clothes, to manage a household with confidence instead of fear. Thomas showed her the farm's workings, which fields needed what crops, how to read weather in the sky, when to plant and when to harvest. They built something together that was more than survival, though it had started there. The town learned to accept them, if not embrace them. Lydia would never be welcomed into the ladies' sewing circle or invited to social gatherings. But she could shop without harassment, could attend church without whispers drowning out the sermon, could exist without constantly defending her right to be there. It was a cold peace built on exhaustion rather than reconciliation, but it held. One Sunday in October, with the leaves turning gold and the air finally cooling, Reverend Walsh stopped by after services. He accepted coffee on the porch, watched the girls playing in the yard, and smiled. "You've done well," he said. "All of you. Built something solid from very little." "We've had help," Thomas said, glancing at Lydia. "More than we expected." "Help is always a gift, but you have to be willing to receive it. A lot of people aren't." Walsh sipped his coffee. "I'll be moving on soon. Winter routes start next month. But I wanted you to know, before I go, that what you've built here matters. Not just to your family, but to everyone who's watching. You've proven that people can change their circumstances, can make family from choice instead of blood, can survive with dignity even when the world says they shouldn't." "We just tried to stay," Lydia said quietly. "You did more than stay. You claimed your right to be here. That's different." Walsh set down his cup. "Too many people let others define their worth, let society's judgment become their truth. You refused, both of you. And those girls are going to grow up knowing that belonging isn't something you beg for, it's something you build." After he left, Lydia sat with his words, turning them over like stones smoothed by water. She thought about the woman who'd collapsed at the edge of town, certain she'd reached the end of her road. Thought about everything that had happened since, the small kindnesses and large cruelties, the fight for basic dignity, the slow transformation from stranger to wife to mother to woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked Thomas. "What we've built here?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching Clara and Sadie make crowns from fallen leaves. "I think it's everything," he said finally. "House, family, land we can call ours. Future that's stable enough to plan for. That's more than most people ever get." It's more than I ever expected, Lydia admitted. Then we're both lucky. Lucky wasn't quite the right word. Luck implied chance, and this had been built through choice and stubbornness and refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier. But she understood what he meant. Despite everything, or maybe because of it, they'd found something worth keeping. Winter came cold and hard, but they were prepared. The root cellar was full, the animals secured, the house weatherproofed against the worst storms. They spent long evenings around the fire, Thomas reading to the girls, Lydia mending clothes, all of them together in warmth and safety, while wind howled outside. On Christmas morning, Clara and Sadie woke to find presents they hadn't expected. New dresses Lydia had sewn in secret, a carved horse from their father, peppermint sticks from Jacob Chen, who'd left them on the porch before dawn. The girls shrieked with delight, throwing themselves at their parents with the kind of uncomplicated joy that made every hard moment worth surviving. "Best Christmas ever," Clara declared, spinning in her new dress. "We didn't even have presents last year," Sadie said, hugging her carved horse. "Just sad potatoes." "They weren't sad potatoes," Thomas protested. "They were very sad," Clara confirmed. "But this year is different. This year we have Lydia." The simple statement landed with unexpected weight. Lydia felt her throat tighten, felt Thomas's hand find hers under the table, felt the absolute certainty that these children, this man, this home they'd built from determination and desperate hope, this was everything she'd been walking toward without knowing it. "Yes," she said softly. "This year, you have me." That night, after the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, Thomas knocked softly on Lydia's door. She opened it to find him holding something wrapped in cloth. "Forgot to give you this earlier," he said, almost shy. "Wasn't sure if you'd want it, but I made it anyway." She unwrapped the cloth to find a wooden box, small and beautifully crafted, with her initials, LR now, not LM, carved into the lid. Inside, lined with soft fabric, was a photograph. The four of them on their wedding day, slightly blurred but unmistakably real. "Jacob took it," Thomas explained. "Had it developed in the next county. Thought you might want something to remember the day by. I know it wasn't much of a wedding, but it was perfect," Lydia interrupted, her voice thick. "It was exactly what it needed to be." She looked at the photograph, at Thomas standing straight and serious, at the girls grinning despite their attempts at formality, at herself looking fragile but determined, scarred hands visible even in the small image. They looked like a family, felt like one too. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The box, the photo, the life you've given me." "We gave each other," Thomas corrected gently. "You saved us too, Lydia. Never forget that." He kissed her forehead, chaste and sweet, the same gesture he'd made at their wedding, and left her standing there with a box full of proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she'd built something real from nothing at all. Spring arrived with mud and new growth, with planting and planning and the kind of hope that came from surviving winter intact. The girls shot up like weeds, requiring new dresses and shoes, and the patient attention of a mother who no longer questioned her right to the title. The town had moved on to other scandals, other concerns, leaving the Reeds to live their lives without constant scrutiny. Lydia planted a kitchen garden, larger than before, with herbs and flowers mixed among the vegetables. She took pride in making the house beautiful as well as functional, in creating spaces that felt like home instead of shelter. And slowly, carefully, she let herself believe that this life was permanent, that she didn't need to keep one foot pointed toward the door in case everything collapsed. One afternoon in May, she was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Her hand stilled on the line, old fear rising automatic, until she recognized the rider. Mrs. Miller, alone, looking uncertain. "Mrs. Reed," she said, dismounting. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." "Well, Lydia wiped her hands on her apron, wary but polite. "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Miller shifted her weight, uncomfortable. "I came to apologize. Properly, not through my daughter. For turning you away from the store, for being too afraid to stand up to the council, for every time I chose my comfort over your dignity. You deserved better, and I failed you." The apology was unexpected and clearly cost her something to deliver. Lydia studied the older woman, saw genuine regret in her expression, saw the courage it took to admit wrongdoing, and felt some of her anger ease. Thank you for saying that, Lydia said quietly. It means more than you know. I also came to ask if you might consider joining the church quilting group. We meet Thursdays, and we could use someone with your skill. Saw the dress you made for Clara? That kind of needlework is rare. It was an olive branch, an invitation into community Lydia had been excluded from since arriving. Part of her wanted to refuse, to nurse her grievances and maintain her isolation. But she thought about what Reverend Walsh had said about building instead of begging, about claiming belonging through participation instead of permission. I'd like that, she said. Thank you for asking. Mrs. Miller's smile was relieved and genuine. Thursday, then, 2 o'clock at the church. After she left, Lydia stood in the yard feeling something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Some wounds took longer to heal than others, but acceptance, maybe. Recognition that people could change, could grow, could choose differently when given the chance. Thursday arrived bright and warm. Lydia dressed carefully, braided her hair, and walked into town with her sewing basket and her scars visible, and her head held high. The quilting circle was small. 6 women gathered around a frame, working on a wedding quilt for someone's daughter. They looked up when she entered, and Lydia saw calculation in some faces, curiosity in others, welcome in a few. Mrs. Reed, said Martha Chen, Jacob's wife, gesturing to an empty chair. We saved you a seat. Lydia sat and picked up a needle, joining the rhythm of the work. The conversation flowed around her, gossip about neighbors, concerns about crops, the small talk that built community through shared attention. No one asked about her past. No one mentioned the scandal. They simply accepted her presence and moved on. By the time she walked home that evening, Lydia felt lighter. Not because she'd been forgiven. Forgiveness implied she'd needed it, and she refused to accept blame for surviving, but because she'd been included. Because for the first time since arriving, she'd participated in ordinary town life without it being remarkable. Thomas noticed immediately when she got home. Good day? Good day, she confirmed, and told him about the quilting circle, about Mrs. Miller's apology, about the simple pleasure of being treated like she belonged. Told you they'd come around eventually, he said, pulling her into a hug that had become more natural over the months. Just took them a while to catch up. That night, lying in bed in her small room that felt less temporary with each passing season, Lydia thought about the journey that had brought her here. From fire to walking to a tree at the edge of town to this, a home, a family, a place in a community that had fought her every step but finally, grudgingly, made room. She thought about the woman she'd been, certain she'd never be worth more than the ash people saw. Thought about how wrong she'd been, how much stronger survival had made her, how claiming her own worth had mattered more than anyone granting it. She was Lydia Reed now, wife, mother,